military propaganda to dissuade a potential University of the Philippines Diliman student from going to the mountains in the Compostela and Sagada region is to be able to demonize these rebels as people who really are fighting for illegitimate causes and who are not really that good persons in the first place. So what's the problem? How will it be not effective? One, we say that their military propaganda will be targeted in terms of rebel-infested areas for their benefit to be very effective. But in these rebel-infested areas, you have a lot of children and even minors who have parents and relatives that are part of the NPA or the MILF movements. Therefore, if you show military propaganda in those schools, for example, in Compostela Valley or in Maguindanao and Zamboanga, you're going to create tension in terms of how children perceive their parents. But it will not be effective in children telling their parents, Mom, Pap, you should not be able to fight the government, or I should not join the rebel movement. Because parents have a stronger influence in terms of how their children will look at society. So even if we assume that it is very effective, we say parents are more effective in countering whatever information military propaganda can give. So on the first level, it's not effective. But in terms of the point of information I asked, they support the children of rebels going to school, because we agree this is a value. Children of rebels need to be taught that the government is not bad, the military is not bad. But in their side, when you allow military propaganda in schools, the parents of these children and the relatives of these children will not allow these children anymore to go to schools, knowing that there is military propaganda being done by the government and the military in schools. So you're denying these children of rebels the very important information you're saying is needed for them to be able to denounce the insurgency problem. Last argument, we think that their proposal will actually result in more children being recruited into the rebel movement. This is because for any military propaganda to work, it will have to demonize the rebel movements they're trying to fight against so that you won't join that kind of evil movement. But in this terms of demonization, children of relatives of NPA rebels or families of NPA rebels will necessarily feel insulted and offended, and they will feel stronger in their stance that their families are being attacked in terms of their personalities, and they will feel the resolve to actually join the rebel movement instead. And they will talk to their peers and their fellow classmates that they are maligning my families and relatives, and therefore you should join the rebel movement. Because their proposal is not necessary, it's not effective, it's actually more harmful. The University of the Philippines is proud to oppose. Thanks.
I'd like to thank the leader of the opposition, let's call the Deputy Prime Minister.
Where are the insurgents found and how did they come about? These insurgents are normally found in parts of Davao and southern Mindanao, where a key factor in them recruiting people there is the government's neglect of indigenous communities, and these individuals and these communities are displaced, and NPA goes there and come up with ties with the small-scale local miners who oppose larger mining companies that displace these people. These partnerships between indigenous communities and the NPA highlights the inaction of the government against their plight and supports these people that oppresses them. In Negros, the failure of the government to reform the hacienda system, under which the rich people owns majority of the land and the peasants are left with nothing, still highlights, ladies and gentlemen, how these people are suffering. And that's capitalized by the NPA that tells them that we are able to provide you with tools to topple off that system and change things. So, in response to first speaker from the opposition bench, we think that existing alternatives of democratic means simply is not enough. We have to take a more aggressive stance, ladies and gentlemen. Because if you are a teenager growing up exposed to all these realities, ladies and gentlemen, and injustices that happen to you, it's not that difficult to get you to join the insurgents' ranks, take up arms, and pressure changes within the system because they could not ignore you if you have guns. The sad reality is that this rhetoric is used by the CPP NPAs, one that resonates so much to these communities. Why is that? Firstly, because these insurgents come from these remote areas as well. These guys have already said that they are relatives of these people. They know the plight of the poor peasants against abusive hacienderos. They understand the voices of indigenous communities against exploitative industries that displace these people from their ancestral lands. We've already told you, ladies and gentlemen, how this is the dominant propaganda in these areas, and we need to counter that, ladies and gentlemen. In light of this, why is the current military strategy ineffective and worse, not targeted? First, a strategy that incorporates propaganda is one that is not in denial of the fact that a purely military and combative approach from the AFP would not win the hearts and minds of the youths in this community. Why is that? The relationship between these communities and the militaries is quite, complicated. Communities are like damsels in distress, one that waits for her Prince Charming to rescue her when insurgents raise their villages. This victim narratives of these communities silences the unraveling of the multifacetedness of the problem that happens there, ladies and gentlemen. Why is this relevant in this debate? First, the military propaganda will only be effective if people on the ground sees that joining the NPA is less palatable and not a viable alternative because the state is doing something to fix the injustices in these rural areas, ladies and gentlemen, which means that economic reforms and the propaganda that we are talking about is not mutually exclusive. It happens simultaneously because it is imperative that economic reforms happen in order for the propaganda to have any sense of legitimacy, ladies and gentlemen. Because if these people don't see the effectiveness of how this transforms their community, if they don't see a health care or a health clinic there, if they don't see farm-to-market roads that are being built there, they would not listen and they will still think that the NPA is the best way to go.
Sir.
Sit down. But second of all, ladies and gentlemen, according to them, we will need to demonize these rebels and insurgents. That's false. We're going to provide a reasonable extent, ladies and gentlemen. Because if these guys are so beholden to the community and so attached to these communities, if we exaggerate, it won't resonate to people on the ground, which means that these people will not believe you if you demonize them too much, ladies and gentlemen. The kind of message that our propaganda would say is that it's unnecessary for you to do that because the state is listening to your plight. You don't have to take up
Point,
arms.
sir.
We are dealing with your problems right now, and it's dangerous for you to do that. But then, sit down. But then he told us that, well, children won't be sent to school. That's false, ladies and gentlemen, because the fathers and the families of these children have all the incentive to send these children to school. Why is that? Firstly, it's not like these fathers and their families took up arms and decided to become NPAs because it's fun. Obviously, these are individuals that are left with no choice. Had it been any other way, ladies and gentlemen, they would not do that because it's dangerous, which means that as much as possible, they want their children to be integrated into the mainstream system where their children are educated and that their children are able to find decent jobs after they graduate.
Point,
So
sir.
yes, they will still send their children to school, ladies and gentlemen. No, thank you. But second, we think that this is the perfect time to do this, ladies and gentlemen, because if you try to look at the composition of insurgent groups, they're mostly young people who do not have hardened attachment to the CPP
Point of
NPA's
information.
ideology of communism. But these are people that are just merely discontented and vulnerable to poverty and injustices they see around them, which means that it's easier for us to convince them to go back to the folds of law if they see that changes are happening on the ground, ladies and gentlemen. Before I proceed, yes.
If academics and teachers and NGOs criticize the military for its abuses, such as extrajudicial killings and torture, what are you going to do with them? Are you going to stop
This
them
is
from
the perfect
criticizing the
response
military?
as well, ladies and gentlemen. Because the military will be looked at differently by these communities. Right now, these communities view the military as an uncaring killing machine that killed their relatives, ladies and gentlemen, and they're left with nothing. This time, we make them realize that the military isn't an enemy, but a partner of these individuals that's genuinely concerned about them, ladies and gentlemen, and is willing to help them get out of the dire situation where they are in. This also means that when we roll out the propaganda program, and this is a response as to how economic reforms is going to happen, ladies and gentlemen, the state will not just augment the curriculum of these schools, but would shift in how it views the problem. Armed forces of the Philippines have already made great strides in achieving this. Now, it already employs both military and non-combative strategies. Under this strategy, communities are not seen as victims, not as helpless bunch of people, but are crucial stakeholders in implementing peace strategies. This means that the government would also have all the initiatives to make sure that economic reforms happen on the ground and these people will feel that. What happens after? We empower these communities to be invested in sustainable peace, ladies and gentlemen, because they have all the interests to make sure that this is maintained. Because obviously, when they start benefiting from all of these things that the state is providing them, they would not have any interest in disrupting it or taking up arms because that's no longer necessary. Thank you.
The internal peace and security plan of Bayanihan has a whole-of-nation approach to peace. It has 3 points. The first one being, it puts people as active participants in the pursuit of peace and security. The second one is it believes in the shared concept and understanding of security and peace. And last, it wants to see the AFP that will catalyze the involvement of all stakeholders to facilitate the synergy of efforts for peace. I'm going to show to you in my speech on why these 3 things will not happen under their model. But before I go on, a couple of rebuttals. There's this one idea coming from the previous speaker that economic development and propaganda can happen side by side. I don't think it's true. Why? How will it work? When you have propaganda happening in schools, you will have to sacrifice a bit of time for math and science, which means our already weakened education system will have to suffer even more to make way for these things. We say it doesn't make sense because now you have to funnel money, as my previous speaker, into developing these propaganda, informing, let's say, videos, to convincing the minds of these students. What's the problem here? In the Philippines, we have a scarce amount of resources. Sit down, no thank you. Especially local government units. We don't have enough money. And now you want to spread the resource too thinly. Instead of money going to, let's say, improving teachers or educational materials, you want them to go to, let's say, propaganda. And we think it's a cut off there. It doesn't make sense. But secondly, he tells us the idea that, children of NPA soldiers will still want to go to school. Why is this false? Because he tells us that, look, they want to integrate these kids into the system. It's funny because last time I checked, these NPA people want to fight against the system. They want to change it. They're against the fact that you're a democracy. They want a communist idea.
Sir.
Sit down, no thank you. Which doesn't make sense to why they want their children to integrate. Now, they want their children to go to school to learn math and science. But when you put in propaganda against them, it takes out the incentive for these kids to go to school. It'll push back development even further. Take note, these kids are our citizens. We want them to learn. When you put this incentivizing mechanism to prevent kids from going to school,
Sir.
you'll stop development, you'll stop economic growth. It's not good.
Sir.
Sit down, no thank you. The last idea I want to rebut is this. They tell us that, look, proper democratic means are impossible in some areas and that the NPA will capitalize on this idea and you'll just, convince people to join them. What's my argument
Sir.
for you today? I'm going to show you, sit down, no thank you, and why the first level will not work. It will drive away the trust of people that will stop them to become active participants in the pursuit of peace and security. Now, what is propaganda? We think propaganda is a form of communication that's aimed towards influencing of community attitudes,
Sir.
towards a case, sit down, no thank you, representing only one side, where we try to blow up the fact of the government, portraying them in the good light, and canceling out all their harms. Now, what does this mean? It means that the people will be forced to say only good things about the government. But what's the problem here?
Sir.
When the propaganda that you're trying to describe a reality is different from the actual reality, which they said, nothing will happen. What do I mean by this? They tell us in Negros, what happens is that people don't get their land. But in propaganda, you will have to say your government is actually functioning, your government's actually working. What's the problem here? When you tell them the government's actually working, but in real life, the government isn't working, you'll create a disjunct.
Sir.
Fine, yes.
Sir, we're not going to say that the state is going to lie to them. What we're saying is it's going to happen simultaneously that while the state is making reforms, it's going to tell them that these are the things that you will have if you're not going to consider joining the NPA.
Let's give a couple of examples to why this particular idea won't work. Because in the propaganda, they will say the military will guard our rights. And yet, in the past, we've seen cases of such as Jovito Palparan, who has violated these things. We're not saying they did something bad, but the accusations which happened at the ground level is true. We say in the United Nations Security Council peace report in April 23, 2010, it accused the AFP of using children as war tools. Essentially, we say when you try to portray a truth, but you have an opposing party trying to destroy the idea of AFP or trying to counteract the propaganda, what happens is you will see a disjunct of ideas. What do I mean by this? Because people will defect when government makes promises that they do not fulfill. In the propaganda, you will create promises on the side of the government. They'll say, look, it's actually good. But when people become all talk and no show, what happens is the people will get pissed off. You've seen rallies saying the government does say a lot of things, but they never do anything at all. And what happens here is you will transfer the accountability. The anger that people once had on the government will now apply to the military. What's the problem here? When you form a distrust, because now the military will make promises which they can't fulfill because of, let's say, political officials making different decisions or economic factors which change the image of a real reality versus propaganda, people will distrust you, which means it's a higher propensity for people to recruit to join the CPP or sex it down, no thank you, or even the idea that people will try to cooperate with the rebel troops, and we say it's not a good thing. We want to make sure the military will talk its walk. And the problem is, under propaganda, it's not possible. Sit down, no thank you. The next idea is this, on how it will prevent the sharing of a unified context understanding of peace. Because in any propaganda, it has to be the superior idea or the only idea for it to function. Sit down, no thank you. But if you take a look at how peace process works, you have to make sure you have an equal footing for all ideas of both sides. What do I mean by this? When you have a system that pushes only one side of the idea, and your masses become convinced of one side only, saying the AFP is actually really good, and you try to have a peace talk, it's not going to work out. Because for peace talk to work out properly, the people on the ground level should be able to understand each other, know each sides, or know their wrongs and their rights. The problem here is when you try to convince the masses, or even the youth, that they're actually really bad, or they're very different, or that we're actually faultless, the problem is a peace talk won't work properly. It's going to be harder to integrate these things. You want an area where you can talk about these things freely, and for people to have free speech. My last idea is this, on how it will prevent the involvement of stakeholders and the synergy of efforts in development and peace. What's the problem here? Because besides propaganda, teachers may have opposing ideas. Now, what happens if they say these opposing ideas in class? Outside the propaganda class, teachers will discuss these things. And it will highlight the rift between an imposed view by the government, which is in the propaganda class, and the actual view of teachers who are closer to the students. And we say it'll create a shadow of doubt on the government's ability to protect its image and the truthfulness of its statements. Because now the teacher may have different opinions and it may discuss them in class. It creates a rift and difference. But what if they cannot say these things outside in class? Then it'll be harder for people to speak against the military. It'll be harder for people to speak against the government because you don't have an academic discussion or academic environment for these discussions to happen. And what will happen here? Because it's harder for people to speak up against these things, people will revolt. You've seen a lot of cases. My previous speaker showed to you. In the Marcos era, when people don't have free speech, in the Marcos era, when people could not make changes to discourse, people resort to arms. Now, in this case, because you have a catch-22. If they say something good about it, it highlights the difference. If they don't say anything good about it, you prevent an avenue for discussion. When people cannot talk about it, NPA rebels will now capitalize on that idea, try to give you the only avenue of discussion about the flaws of the government, and then they will try to recruit you in. We don't want this idea to happen. We think is false. Now, in order to summarize my whole speech, I've shown to you the 3 different standards of the Bayanihan project and why it will not work under the model of, say, what government tries to propose. We're proud to oppose this motion. Thank you very much.
I'd like to thank the Deputy Leader of the Opposition. Let's call the affirmative rebuttal speaker.
Ladies and gentlemen, during the time of President Fidel V. Ramos, he had this famous program called Lantad Bitag. And during this time, there was sufficient decrease of the NPA's recruitment because the Lantad Bitag program, as what was already elucidated by my previous speakers, did not only engage the insurgency through military force, but it also recognized that counter-education against insurgents was also an important facet in being able to completely win the war and not just win the battle. After that time, after 1996, the Lantad Bitag program was abandoned because Ramos felt that he needed a gesture to compel the NPA to broker for more sustainable peace. Obviously, that gesture did not work. The NPA rebelled back and is now recruiting even more. Sure, they don't reflect the once 25,000 strong people, but should we wait for them to come up to that number before we do something? Because what affirmative side was able to do in this particular debate was show you that now is the time to strategically place our efforts not only through combat operations against the insurgents, but also through counter-education. Because there's a stigma against propaganda, like what opposition side wants us to believe. The propaganda has to be lies. The propaganda has to be the optimism in looking at things. But we think that propaganda can only work if the government is compelled to reflect the realities of that propaganda. So we don't believe opposition when they say that when the military launches this program in schools, it will only be beguiled to lie to the students. We think that the military is smart enough and creative enough to show the reality that the accusations against them that they are butchers are not entirely true and that the military is reforming. Let's talk about three things in summary. The first is our policy really necessary? Second, will the propaganda be really harmful? And lastly, how do we reduce armed struggle? First of all, let's look at the necessity. According to UP Diliman, the policy is not necessary because there's enough consciousness about the democratic system. But this misses the entire equation because we think that consciousness of the democratic system still does not involve the military as part of that equation. The reason why this motion suggests that the military should be the one that should be spearheading the propaganda is not only because the military is the facet of the government that needs to enforce the rule of law, but it's the military that's the one that's being bad-lighted by the NPA. They're the ones that are being used as ammunition. They're the ones that are being told as poster boys of abuse. And we think that the military has to step in, not only in the form of guns, but also in the form of counter-education against this kind of narrative. But according to them, this is no longer necessary as well, because the numbers are going down, and that's a good thing. But we think that the numbers lie to us. The visibility of the existing NPA force may be withered, but it does not mean that they can still be a potent force in the future. The clearness is that the military recognizes that the NPA is not just an armed force, but it is composed of other individuals who belong to mainstream society, who are just waiting for the time to come up and rebel. And what we're actually doing is that we're sleeping and we're not doing anything about it because our identification of the threat is only through the armed wing. And that's what opposition side wants us to believe. They think that because the numbers are watering down, it's enough for us to be simply, just lax about the entire situation. That's why what we told you in the affirmative side is that this is the time for us to strike. Because now that their numbers are weakened, it means that their ideology is weakened too. You don't give them time to breed that ideology to the youth that are so bridled with energy. And we think that by striking at the very heart of the problem, we reduce the problem in the future as well. We also said that this is important because it is part of the integration towards nation building. The fact that peace cannot simply be achieved only through the means of armed struggle. According to them, this is not going to be effective because it takes away our time. First of all, it's not impossible for a policy to be integrated creatively. It may cost some time, but it's a time that's worth the cost. But more importantly, it can also be integrated into other classes like history or civics. So we're not quite keen on whether or not opposition was correct in accusing us that this is going to be burdened towards the people who we're trying to educate. But more importantly, the military can explore very creative means in discussing the propaganda. We think that the military has enough intelligent people to maybe look at social media, to look at alternative means in being able to creatively display the propaganda without burdening them of such huge costs like, very, very fancy movies. We don't think that's going to be the case. But let's move on to the second point. Will the propaganda be polarizing? We think that yes, this might result into some tension within the families of the people that we're talking about in this debate. But this concession means that propaganda for the NPA is happening right now. Opposition doesn't have any response to that. But more importantly, no propaganda also means that it's more likely that the children growing up in these families will only have one vision of the world, a world that hates the military and hates the national government. What our policy does is that it makes it less likely that this is going to happen because at least children are given the option to decide on two versions of reality, not a version that their family teaches them. We think that it's impossible to make informed choices on their side because you only have one version of the truth. Yes.
Why would extolling the virtues of the military and saying that the military is doing correctly right now stop the recruitment of individuals in impoverished conditions and without any recourse for reforms in those areas. There's no link with the motion.
But it's very hard to enter each specific school and prevent the recruitment because the recruitment is happening in many, many different facets. Your example already proved it. A teacher may speak freely in class and demonize the military. Under your situation, the military has no option or recourse to tell otherwise or correct the information. At least under our side, you give the military equal opportunity to defend itself, to rectify these wrongful accusations through their propaganda. Lastly, how do we reduce armed struggle? We think that the cost for armed struggle is augmented by misinformation against our military. Even if our programs are going to be successful, this is never going to be seen as an ultimate victory of the state. We need to infringe on the recruitment process by also contributing into the market of information. Because information is also part of the battleground. It's not only into the battle of guns against guns, but also the battle of hearts and minds. If we really desire change, we think that change can be achieved through affirmatives proposal. Because words can light fire to the minds of men, but words can also be used to create and change the most hardened of hearts. We're very proud to propose.
The military's integrity is of utmost importance to any state. We citizens generally feel safe when we have trust in the military's intentions, and when we do, especially in rebel-infested areas, we cooperate with the military and the government. In weighing the value of the propaganda to be launched in schools, we need to deconstruct two things. Number one, what it forces the military to say and how it is perceived and interpreted by students. And number two, what it forces the military to do, especially to alternative and opposition perspectives that have to take the back seat simply because we are concerned over the success of the government and the military's propaganda. We are concerned about the success only of our perspective, because what's the point of a propaganda if we are going to allow other perspectives to water it down? And that we need to weigh against the questionable success of the propaganda coming from side affirmative. Because here's where side opposition is telling you that it's one, ineffective, two, unnecessary, and even counterproductive. So, before we proceed, and before any proposal needs to be accepted in any government, you have to justify necessity. Because if you try to deconstruct the problem of insurgency, it was mainly about people being disillusioned with their governments because they are left in very impoverished conditions. This was never because they never knew about government programs elsewhere. This was not because they never knew that the military existed or was there to defend themselves even. Hence,
Sir.
even if you tell them that the military is there, that they are there to protect you, it is a mere reiteration. They already know that. We've already said that when it comes to the
Sir.
class in the Constitution telling us, for example, in high school, for example, on your first year, telling you that the Constitution or the
Sir.
army, for example, is mandated to defend the civilians at the end of the day. If you go to school, it's enough of an information for you to know that. You don't need a military propaganda to be able to drive that
Sir.
into the minds of people. But secondly, you need to understand why economic development cannot occur side by side their military propaganda. First, it's very counterproductive. Because if you try to look at it, the rhetoric coming from very depressed regions is that the government is not spending on my well-being, that there are no
Sir.
facilities, there are no businesses in my area that can benefit me to any extent. Now, this will just strengthen the rhetoric of the rebels when they
Sir.
see you that, for example, when you're hungry, when you are not able to support yourself, for example, and when you're even contemplating the idea of joining the rebel group, because perhaps in a revolution you can experience a certain extent of change
Sir.
and betterment in your life, in that case, side by side, you realizing that, you are also experiencing a state spending on books, spending on reading materials,
Sir.
spending on other things that never to any extent made your stomach feel not hungry anymore. We think that all of these cases fuel the rhetoric of the rebel groups. They say, and right in front of you, it already proves that this is your government prioritization. They'd rather spend on those books that really better the distribution of land, for example, or be able to focus the development on people and really create an impact and not just say something to students. In this case, you need to understand understand that in my head, a more effective counter-propaganda, if it's really necessary, is just developing and transforming depressed areas and rebel-infested areas without having to promise them something. Because these promises, especially on a large scale, in the whole Philippines, in every school, all of these promises are bound to be broken at some extent. There will be areas that will be left with no economic development because we have to prioritize at certain points in time.
Sir.
And when these things happen, side by side, our promise coming from the military, we think that it breeds a disillusionment because
Sir.
that broken promise of our LGU, of other politicians, now bleeds to military men who are never even the ones who are supposed to create this economic development, who are just there to defend
Sir.
people, but are now blamed as well by the other failures of the government simply because the content of the propaganda was not fulfilled at the end of the day.
Sir.
We think that this type of disillusionment can't happen if there was no propaganda to begin with. Let's just go on
Sir.
developing and transforming communities. But before I proceed, yes.
Without a propaganda that is contingent on people seeing changes on the ground, how do you make it imperative for the government to introduce developmental changes?
Because your idea of a propaganda is making people realize that the government is doing something. By having a military man stand in front of a classroom and tell people the government is doing something. How about my idea of a counter-propaganda, wherein a government transforms a community, builds roads, for example, and develop their community without having someone say something? Because you no longer have to say something because people see it directly on the ground without the government having to promise through the military men. Affirmative side, as their only defense, wants us to believe that it was only because of Fidel V. Ramos's counter-propaganda in schools that led to the further decrease of insurgents in high school, underage children, for example. But they're being selective because you can't just draw causality between the program and the decline of the numbers of the rebel groups. You need to understand that right at that same time, the Philippines experienced was able to claim one of its highest GDP. And it's most closely draws the link between economic development and not having to say or promise something, and at the end of the day, develop communities just so they will be disincentivized to go to an armed struggle and just go integrate themselves in society and engage in business. A perfect example for everyone would be in Bulacan, which was a formerly infested area of the NPAs, for example. But when people of Bulacan, for example, started to become prosperous because they are already engaged by the government when it comes to economic development, well, it led to a natural decline of infestations of the NPA in the area because even the rebels themselves, those adults, are already considering not sacrificing their lives for a cause that has a huge promise up way ahead, but rather integrating themselves into the system that will better them through economics. Now, you need to understand that the overarching goal of this debate is to prevent children from being recruited by insurgents. So let's talk about those children that are in those infested areas. What was their response when we told you that inevitably when you have a propaganda, you will have to demonize their parents and relatives? Will they even listen to you? The children that you need to rescue from being recruited are the children that are most predisposed not to listen to any military propaganda. It is an easy proof of the ineffectivity of the military propaganda, especially to people that need it most. However, if you try to look at other people, for example, i.e. average citizens who are not predisposed to believe in the rebels or the government at the same time, the government making promises and the government putting itself in a very vulnerable position to be accountable over these promises that it's forced to make because it's forced to launch a propaganda at the end of the day, creates a space for the rebels to use against them as a counter-rhetoric that the government is failing and it's only promising you something again. Now, we can see that the military should take steps to counter recruitment of the youth, yes. The government just must, however, go on with economic and community development without launching a propaganda